Good afternoon, friends. My name is Father Augustine Reisenauer, and I am the director of the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies at Providence College, and one of the members of the Martin Luther King Jr. Convocation Committee. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our MLK Global Colloquium. We are delighted to have three scholars from around the world who will be guiding our reflections together on some of the common principles, such as social justice, racial harmony, resilience, faith, charity, and others, which were operative in the lives and legacies of two Martins: Martin Luther King Jr., a 20th century American Black pastor and civil rights leader, and Martín de Porres, a 16th, 17th century Peruvian Black friar and Dominican saint. One of our speakers is Sister Maeve McMahon. Sister Maeve is a Dominican sister who lived and worked in New Orleans, Louisiana for 27 years. And during this time, she was the principal of a school of excellence and was honored in the White House and by the Department of Education of Louisiana as an outstanding principal. As a scholar, Sister Maeve is the author of several books: the award-winning Writing Out the Hurricane, also A Dream of Fire, a story about Dominic Guzman, and most recently, The Son of an Unknown Father, a story about Martin de Porres, published by Paulus Press in 2023, which will be the focus of her contributions today. And a link to that book will be provided in the chat on our webinar. Sister Maeve joins us from Dublin, Ireland, where she currently lives. Another of our speakers is Dr. Celia Cusson. Dr. Cusson teaches colonial Latin American history at the University of Chile in Santiago, where she has consolidated the field of African diaspora studies. Among her scholarly works, she is the author of Black Saint of the Americas: The Life and Afterlife of Martin de Porres, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. More recently, she has published on the trade in enslaved Africans and their descendants in Southern South America and the attempts of these men and women to attain their freedom and confront the challenges of racialized hierarchies in the colonialized world. During her new research project, we'll look at the emergence of a global devotion to Martin de Porres in the decades leading up to his canonization in 1962, in the many contexts of the expansion of Dominican missions, the Cold War, the decolonization of Africa, and liberation theology. She is particularly interested in the meanings that local communities attribute to his life and intercession, including the civil rights movement in the United States and the Troubles in Ireland. And our third speaker is Father Vivian Boland. Father Vivian is a Dominican friar and priest of the Irish province. Completing his studies at the University of Edinburgh, the Angelicum, and the Gregorian, Father Vivian has been involved in various pastoral works in Ireland, England, Trinidad, and Tobago, and he has taught moral and pastoral theology at the Irish and English Dominican Houses of Studies near Dublin and at Oxford. At the University of Oxford, he was the director of the Aquinas Institute. A prolific scholar, especially of St. Thomas Aquinas, Father Vivian's books include Ideas in God According to St. Thomas Aquinas, Sources and Synthesis, published by Brill in 1996, St. Thomas Aquinas, published by Bloomsbury Continuum in 2007, Thomas Aquinas, The Mind and Love, published by Catholic Truth Society in 2009, and most recently, The Spirit of Catholicism, published by Bloomsbury Continuum in 2021. Father Vivian also wrote the foreword to Sister Maeve's most recent book. And among his servant leadership positions within the Order of Preachers, Father Vivian has served as the Socius for Northwest Europe and Canada, the Socius for Initial Formation, and the Vicar to the Master of the Order. We are delighted to welcome these scholars from around the globe. And so with respect to the schedule of our global colloquium, we will begin with a presentation by Dr. Cusson, who will guide us in contextualizing what it means to explore and to express the lives of such saints as Martin de Porres, Today in the Modern World. Our next segment will feature Father Vivian, who will share with us some of his reflections on Martin de Porres and his holiness, especially considering the current state of the Church in and since the Second Vatican Council. Afterwards, we will hear from Sister Maeve, who will discuss some of the insightful vignettes from her biography of Martin de Porres. And finally, we'll bring our speakers together for a brief interactive conversation, which will then open up to some Q&A with questions and comments, which I invite you, the online audience, to ask and share with our presenters. So throughout this webinar, please feel free to submit your questions and comments using the Q&A functionality on this platform. And as moderator, I will then ask your questions and articulate your comments to our speakers during the concluding segment of the webinar. Many thanks in advance for your kindness in asking your questions and sharing your comments. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Cusson to speak.
Thank you very much, Father Augustine, for this invitation and this opportunity to participate with friends from Ireland, Sister Maeve McMahon and Father Vivian Boland in the Martin Luther King Convocation at Providence College and this global colloquium. I will try to keep my remarks brief so you can hear from the other speakers, and especially from Sister Maeve, whose wonderful new book, Son of an Unknown Father, brings us together today. What I'd like to do before they speak is to suggest that we consider the life of Martin Luther King, the great inspiring figure of the civil rights movement in the United States, alongside that of another holy Martin, Saint Martin of Porres, an African Dominican of the 17th century. As we shall see throughout this conversation, although these men lived a continent and many centuries apart, they shared similar life experiences that led them to similar conclusions about the importance of love for one another and what Martin Luther King termed the beloved community of men and women of all races and social positions. Martin Luther King is, of course, well known and much beloved in the United States today, an extraordinary man of religion who suffered firsthand the difficulties of segregation and systemic racial discrimination in the 20th century. Based on what he saw among Black communities in the South and experienced in his own life, King championed the dignity of the poor and oppressed in American society, especially for African Americans. And he famously and eloquently preached for equality and the bonds of brotherhood among all men and women. Martin of Porres, on the other hand, was born in Lima, Peru in 1579 to a Spanish father who refused to put his name on his son's baptismal certificate, and a formerly enslaved woman of African descent, Ana Velázquez, who worked as a domestic servant. He entered the Dominican convent at only 15 and took the robes of a voluntary and professed oblate, or voluntary servant, where he went to work as the community's nurse and healer, and he quickly acquired the skills. Unlike Martin Luther King, Martin of Porres was not a preacher, but rather he expressed himself through his healing hands. He soon became one of the most famous medicine men in Lima and kept at his trade until his death of typhoid fever in 1639. The city of Lima during Martin's lifetime was like many towns in the Americas, with a very diverse and highly stratified population. The city was about half Black, including many enslaved people. About 40% of the population was of European descent, and 10% were Andeans. The elite, the Spaniards, were merchants, professionals, priests, and crown officers, either born in Spain or descended from those who were. The native Andeans and Blacks of the city served them as laborers, tribute payers, or household workers. Although his father was a Spaniard, Martin's African ancestry and formerly enslaved status of his mother relegated him to the lower rungs of this society. He could not aspire to the priesthood, nor could he study at the university with the hope of becoming a physician. although as a healer, he could and did circulate throughout all the neighborhoods of Lima, successfully alleviating the fevers and suturing the wounds of not only the friars in the convent of about 300 people, but also the Andeans who dwelt in shacks on the outskirts of town, the enslaved laborers at the Dominican hacienda, and the poor of all kinds in the city. His compassion for those who suffered extended to the animal kingdom as well. He famously cared for beaten dogs and broken-winged vultures. Although he was not a preacher like Martin Luther King, Martin taught by example the importance of recognizing everyone, especially the oppressed, as members of God's community who deserved love and care. Although his life was much celebrated always in Lima, the story of Martin only became known in the United States at the time of the Civil War. Tired of the segregation that relegated them to the back pews of their church and denied their children a public education, a group of African-American parishioners of St. Matthew's Catholic Church in Washington, D.C., decided to build a school and a chapel of their own to be named for Martin of Porres. In 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln granted them permission to hold a fundraising festival of the city's many churches on the White House lawn. And as a result, the chapel and school to Martin were erected in the city's capital. Some years later, a national organization of Black Catholics in this country, the Federated Colored Catholics, wrote in 1924 that they saw in the figure of Martin of Porres a holy man who could, I'm quoting, unite Black Catholics in a closer bond and raise the overall position of Black Catholics within the church and bring about a greater participation of Black Catholics in the cause of racial justice. This is 1924. Dominican priests, including Father McGlynn of Providence College, who's the author of the wonderful statue of Martin that you have on the college grounds, took up the cause for Martin as well, reminding Catholics that, like so many in the United States, Martin had been poor and a laborer who had had to put up with humiliations because of his skin color. Another priest at the time put it even more clearly. Martin's canonization would demonstrate that there is no racial segregation in heaven. His story began to resonate strongly, not only among the Blacks in the United States, but among people in many places who had, like Martin, suffered discrimination based on their social or racial origins. His popularity surged in the 1940s and 1950s when many community centers and schools were established in his name in Ghana, the Philippines, Mexico, and Ireland. Spurred on by this great international devotion to Martin, in 1962, at the height of the civil rights movement and amidst the growing concern for the poor and suffering in the lead up to Vatican II, Pope John XXIII canonized Martin as the patron of racial justice. In his homily, the Pope declared that Martin's canonization represented the vindication of all the oppressed of the world. And the Vatican newspaper that day added that Martin rises to bear witness to the principles of unity, universalism, and equality that Christianity has affirmed powerfully in the world. It was a long road from 17th century Lima to the canonization celebration at the Vatican. And the life story of Martin was kept alive for more than 300 years thanks to the enduring Catholic tradition of recording and recounting the lives of the heroes of the church, the saints. Probably the most famous writer of sacred biographies was the Dominican priest Jacobus de Voragine, who penned the golden legend of the 13th century, in which he spun out the stories of the most famous saints of the time, creating a work that would be a literary sensation for centuries, translated into many languages and going through hundreds of editions, to which new saint stories were added and old stories were amended and reshaped to give refreshed meaning to the men and women of the times. Although Martin of Porres lived only much later, his life joined the tradition of the memory keeping of saints by means of a very substantial process that sought to record his life and his many miracles. Shortly after his death, more than 150 witnesses stood before a panel of ecclesiastic judges to share vignettes from Martin's childhood, stories of his interactions with his families, and his immensely charitable actions as a Dominican servant and healer. One by one, Spaniards, Andeans, and Afro-Peruvians spoke in their own words of Martin's kindness, of his spectacular ability to heal, and of the many ways he urged them to treat each other with warmth and reconcile with their family members or friends after a rift. These testimonies were then collected and worked into a narrative of the life of the putative saint by a Peruvian friar, also Dominican, who hoped to spread the story of Martin's outstanding kindness and piety to generations of Catholics throughout the Christian world. This first biography was translated into many languages, went through many editions, and was complemented by new versions written throughout the 19th and especially the 20th centuries. Today, we have a new retelling of Martin's story by Sister Maeve McMahon, who displays an admirable talent for pulling us into domestic scenes between Martin and his mother, or the moments when the saint consoled the slaves on the Dominican plantation, to take just two examples. She uses contemporary and vivid language to immerse us in situations that ring true to our experiences and introduce us to a man who might have lived yesterday. This, for me, is the magic of Sister Maeve's book. With verve, she evokes gestures, situations, and feelings to submerge us in the life of this African-descended Peruvian who left this world almost 400 years ago. In it, she amply fulfills what Jacobus Ivaragine attempted to do. It allows us to see Martin as though he were passing under our window on his way to see a patient, his medicine bag tied to his waist. She reminds us also that his dark skin relegated him to an inferior outsider status. Sister Maeve McMahon continues with his great tradition of the histories of the saints with a new history of Martin then that draws us into the world of colonial Peru at the same time that it makes the concerns of Martin, his mother, the friars, and the stratified and unequal society of his time quite familiar to us today. Sister Maeve pays careful attention to the historical details of 17th century Lima. I can attest to that as a historian. But her true gift is to grab us by our own very contemporary feelings of wonder, admiration, shame, suffering, and love, to present us with a life and a renewed model of life in St. Martin. As you will soon hear when she reads to us from Son of an Unknown Father, Maeve McMahon brings Martin's gifts, his struggles, and his infinite kindness and concern for community up to our very doorstep. We see him, we hear him, and I think we share his world and his concerns for what the other Martin, Martin Luther King, would famously call the beloved community.
Many thanks, Dr. Cusson, for your insightful presentation. And next, we can turn our attention to Father Vivian. Father Vivian?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to have been asked by Sister Maeve to write the preface for her book, and honored to be asked to contribute to this webinar as well. And my contribution will be proportionate, like the foreword to the book. So just a brief contribution, and leave the field then to Sister Maeve. And I would entitle it Saint Martin and Two Popes, maybe to think about Pope John the 23rd and his decision to canonize Martín de Porres just a few months before the opening of the Second Vatican Council in 1962. And we think of the council, the main personalities of the council as bishops, theologians, and maybe also journalists. These were the three important characters of Second Vatican Council, doing its work and disseminating its fruits. But Martin is none of these things. And he's not a bishop, he's not a theologian, he's not a journalist. It's His Holiness which John the 23rd wanted to promote and place before the Church in the run-up to the Council, because so much has happened after Second Vatican Council and it continues to be debated and discussed. But for the Pope, his hope was that it would lead the Church to a life of greater holiness and virtue, that the outcome of the Council would be not documents and debates and discussions, all of that, has gone on. But in the first place, a life of greater holiness and virtue, a spiritual renewal in the first place. And he chose Martin de Porres as the example for the Church to contemplate in those final months of preparation for Vatican II. Why Martin de Porres? Because his holiness, the holiness of this saint, takes us right to the heart of the gospel, to the heart of the teaching and life of Jesus. To be holy means to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that was the secret, which is not a secret, of Martin de Porres' holiness. Nothing more and nothing less than simply living the great commandment with perseverance and in a heroic way, consistently, perseveringly, and with exceptional generosity, to love God and to love his neighbor. So Dr. Cosson has already explained the facts about his life, his racial origins, his contribution to healing, his interest in animals, many of the concerns of our own day, racism, the environment, living interculturally, another thing which Martin helps us to think about, living interculturally. And coming from the margins, this brings us to mind the second Pope I want to talk about, which is Francis, and to try to relate very briefly Martin's holiness with the priorities of Pope Francis, I suppose we might put it like that, who has often spoken about looking to the peripheries, to the margins, to see what are the voices speaking to us from the peripheries, the central highways of communication and power and economics and politics and so on get plenty of attention. But what about voices coming from the margins, from the peripheries? And very often it is from there that insight and wisdom and a fresh call to holiness come to us. And that's certainly the case with Martin de Porres. A striking thing when Francis spoke to the Dominican General Chapter in 2016, and he decided to try to identify, describe the holiness of Saint Dominic, he didn't pick the moments that Dominicans might be inclined to pick. The beginning of the preaching mission, Dominic's genius for government, for example. The moment that Pope Francis focused on was a very Martin de Porres moment. And it was when Dominic was a young student and found himself in a city where there was a famine and sold his books in order to buy food for the people who are hungry. And Pope Francis said, there's the key to the holiness of Saint Dominic, his compassion, his response to the cry of the flesh of Christ. That was the way he described it. The flesh of Christ is crying out. The body of Christ is needy. And Dominic showed himself to be a follower of Jesus by doing something about that, by responding in the way that he did. And it links very much with Martin. If we think about the Gospels that describe Martin de Porres' life most eloquently, you would think of the Good Samaritan, which is the Gospel in the Dominican lectionary for his feast day, the Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. Matthew 25, which is so often quoted by Pope Francis in describing the Christian life. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was sick and you visited me. And Matthew 5, the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Just a last thought, Martin de Porres, the Martin of Charity, as he's called, he was able, one of the remarkable things reported about him was that he was able to enter even where doors were locked. So he could turn up in a house or in a room, even where the doors were locked. But my final thought is just to take that as something that the world needs. There are locked doors, there are locked minds, there are locked hearts, and the progress of the world towards peace and reconciliation and justice it needs the unlocking of these doors, or at least that there are people who are able to find their way into the locked places in people's hearts and minds. And in that too, then we could take Martin, Pope Francis has great devotion to Our Lady, untire of knots. Maybe we could promote St. Martin de Porres as the unlocker of doors, helping us to work to find our way to convince people, to calm people's fears and anxieties, and to help them to open their minds to the call of the gospel, to the great commandment, which is the basis for the beloved community. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Father Vivian, for your very thoughtful and insightful remarks. We can now invite Sister Maeve to share some of her insights with us.
Thank you most sincerely for inviting me to participate in this year's Martin Luther King Global Colloquium. I'm honored to be able to share some excerpts from my book, Son of an Unknown Father, which tells the story of a Dominican saint of the 16th, 17th centuries who loved others, even the unlovable, and was loved in return. Martin de Porres, the first Black saint of the Americas, was canonized in 1962, a few months before the Second Vatican Council began, and a year before Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. His story began in Lima, Peru, as recorded in the baptismal registry in the Church of San Sebastian. The entry verified that Martin was born on one of the lowest rungs of the social ladder, the illegitimate son of a former African slave. His father's missing name excluding his son from his social group. It reads, "On Wednesday, the 9th of December, 1579, I baptized Martin, son of an unknown father, and of Ana Velasquez, a free Black woman. The godparents were Juan de Bribiesca and Ana de Escorena. I have signed this, Juan Antonio Polanco." Martin knew that his mother resented him for having her features and dark skin. She once said that if he and his sister Juana, who was 2 years younger than her brother, had looked more like their wealthy Spanish father, he may not have disowned them, and life may not have been so hard. Now, Anna worked as a servant and began sending Martin to buy food for the family when he was aged 6. He often returned home with no bread nor money. I write to bring the reader into the room with Martin as he faces his frustrated mother. What delayed you? A dark-skinned woman, beads of perspiration glistening on her forehead, turned towards the young boy who had just come through the door into the small dark room. She had been folding clothes on a rough plank of wood, resting on an upturned, cracked clay jug. The little boy tightened his grip on the handle of the basket he was carrying. It swung awkwardly at arm's length, its rough cane scratching his shins as he shifted nervously from one leg to the other. Earlier that day, his mother had given him the basket and a small coin, saying, "Martin, you're a big boy now. You're 6 years old. Go to the market for a loaf of bread. Be careful now, don't lose the money." Now Martin was standing in front of her with no bread and no money. "I saw the slaves," Martin said, his voice dropping into his body. "Didn't I tell you not to be staring at those slaves?" she thundered. "You should pass by and thank God you're free." Martin's mind flashed back to earlier that day when he had been on his way home with the bread. Time had stood still amid the clanging of moving chains, rasping Spanish voices, and muffled sobs when a young black boy, not much older than himself, stopped in front of him and, on catching sight of his basket, whispered something and pointed to his parched lips. Feeling terrible that he had no water to give him, Martin looked at the round bun he had purchased earlier that day with his mother's hard-earned money. He hesitated for a second, took the bread out of the basket, and pushing it into the boy's outstretched hand, said, "Here, it's all I have." "Slaves? Did I hear you say slaves? Get out of my sight. Go to bed." Blinded with tears, Martin stumbled over to the corner of the room near the door where he slept. He shook out the 2 pieces of sackcloth that made up his bed on the hard floor and lay down on the smaller one, pulling the other one over his head. In this private place, he could be alone and talk to his friend Jesus about the slaves, the bread, and his mother's anger with him. Jesus will understand, he told himself. Life was to take a dramatic turn for Martin when he was 8 years of age. Juan de Porres, his absent father, came to Lima to take the children back with him to Ecuador. And I write, the young boy walked into the dimly lit room which he shared with his mother and sister at the back of the Mosquero house. He was surprised to see a tall white man standing in the middle of the floor, a faint smile playing around his lips. His mother's voice seemed to come from the wall behind the well-dressed man. "Martin, your father wants to take you and your sister back with him to Ecuador," Anna said. An icy hand reached into Martin's chest and squeezed his heart into a small, hard nut. My father," he stammered, lowering his head. His mother had told him many times, often when she was angry, that his father had disowned him when he was born because he was ashamed of him. Martin tightened his body into a sliver of ice. "Come here, boy," the tall Spaniard said, throwing his hat on the rough table and extending his arms for an embrace. Quickly, Martin glanced from the rich white man to his mother standing near the table, her face expressionless, her thin body covered in poor servant's clothing. He searched her dark face and discerned a quiver at the corner of her mouth. Exploding from its hard shell, Martin's heart propelled him into her arms. "Ah, Mama, I don't want to leave you." Anna dropped to her knees, her arms tightly wrapped around her son. Juana began to cry. She ran for comfort into the outstretched arms of the tall white man, called father. "I know this is a shock," Juan de Porres said from the chair where he had sat down with his daughter on his knee, "but it's best. I want the both of you to be educated. The times are changing fast in Peru. You need to be able to read and write." "Listen to your father, Martin," Anna whispered through her tears as she rose slowly from the floor, releasing her hold on her son and pushing him gently towards his father. After that, everything happened in a blur. Martin and Juana got dressed in clothes like those worn by the Mosquero children. They kissed their mother goodbye before they left their home and climbed into their father's stately carriage for the 5-mile journey to Callao, where their ship was docked. As they climbed down from the carriage when they arrived at the port, Juan pointed to the African and Indian slaves bent low under the heavy loads they were hauling onto ships. "Gold and silver bound for Spain," he said with a smile. Martin felt strange. Men who looked like his father were shouting abuse and cracking whips on the backs of men who looked like him. It was as if he had been assigned the role of a changeling in a weird play, stared at unsympathetically by white strangers as Juana and he climbed the gangway on either side of their father to begin the long sea journey to Ecuador. Stared at in derision by harassed slaves who hated to see mulatto children in the company of a conquistador. Only Juan de Porres continued to smile and make comments. When Martin was 12 years old, his father decided to take him back to Lima to begin serving his apprenticeship as a barber. For 3 years, Martin was apprenticed to Marcel de Rivera, who marveled at his intelligence, talent, and Christ-like demeanor. One day, Marcel remarked to one of his Spanish friends that his apprentice drew an amazing number of diverse people to his barber shop for medical help. "They're no longer asking for me, they're asking for him," he said. "Why is that? Sure, he didn't attend university to get the best medical training. He's a mulatto. He must still have a lot to learn. You've been in the job a long time, Marcel. How can he be better than you?" his friend asked. "Martin's very intelligent, all right, but there's more," Marcel said, with a faraway look in his eyes. "Talent and a special calling. He cures the people, all right, but there's more." Marcel said deliberately, "God uses him." Nodding his head, he added, "Yeah, he's like Jesus." It was 1594. Martin de Porres was 15 years old when he asked to be given the chance to become a donado, a servant of the Dominican community in El Rosario, to live under the same roof as the Dominican friars, to be close to Jesus, the love of his life. However, he found the prejudices that were prevalent in society were in the convent too. Broom in hand, Martin kept the cloister, cells, and corridors free of dirt and dust. Whatever he was asked to do, he did with a gracious smile. It wasn't long before he was asked to be the convent's barber. One day, a novice, Francis Velasco Carabantes, came to Martin to have his hair cut. He ordered curtly, "Trim my hair. I hate the tonsure, so I just want to trim." The tonsure was the special monastic cut, which was shaped like a bowl with a bald center. Martin lathered the young man's head with soap and water, toweled it dry, and while Francis read a book, cut his hair closely at the crown, giving him a short back and sides as the rule required. When the novice caught sight of himself in the mirror with a tonsure that he detested, he began to shout abuse at Martin. "You hypocrite and cheat. You knew that I didn't want a tonsure. Of course, what else should I expect from a mulatto dog?" The convent's disciplinarian, waiting to have his hair cut, was shocked at the way the novice verbally abused Martin and said that he would report him to the novice master, saying he needs to know the kind of young man you are. Martin struggled with the feelings of hurt and resentment that Francis caused to rise up within him. He was glad that the disciplinarian was there to witness what had happened. Francis would get his comeuppance, but Martin was on a spiritual journey. God's grace had poured into his heart, channeling his negative feelings into thoughts of love and forgiveness. Recalling Jesus' words in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 48, and I quote, "There must be no limit to your goodness, as your heavenly Father's goodness knows no bounds." He went to the novice master and asked him to forgive Francis. After that, he sent to the truculent novice a gift of fresh fruit. But the young, proud novice concluded that he, the son of a wealthy Spaniard, could get his way by calling this mulatto hurtful names and be treated nicely for it. After all, didn't he have proof? The donado had not only gone to the novice master to ask forgiveness for him, but had also sent him a gift of fresh fruit. Francis, the bully, derived pleasure from causing pain to someone whom he perceived to be inferior, weak. But Martin wasn't weak. In fact, he was strong because he derived his strength from Jesus. He knew the importance of choosing a good attitude, no matter the circumstances. Wasn't Jesus an example to him of how to show love to those who mistreated him? Martin was determined to respond to Francis Carabantes with love and a smile on his face. Now we know that Francis preserved the memory of those early days in the monastery intact, so that at the postulation hearings for Martin's beatification, he was able to give one of the most vital testimonies of Martin's life from his personal experience. So I hope that what I have shared is my way of bringing young people into the story of a saint. When we were young, we used to have chances in the classroom to read stories of saints. And maybe we weren't that far removed from the language used then. But when you read some of the archaic language and the stories that are stuck in history in a way that it makes them rather lifeless to young people, I thought that the challenge to me at a time of great disturbance and anxiety among young people, particularly in our day of horrors of war and bullying and suicide and failure to know identity, all of these tensions that young people are living with, I thought what I must try to do is to tell a good story and bring them with their hearts into the story. And if I succeed in doing that, then I will weave in and out of that themes that will help them when the going goes rough. And I wrote during the time of the George Floyd protests. And as you know, I lived for 27 years in New Orleans. So my heart was very much in America at that time, during all the anxiety and all of the suffering of the people. And I wanted to raise up a saint that I truly believe has much to offer young people today. And not only young people, all of us, if we would just open our hearts to a story well told. That's it.
Many thanks, Sister Maeve, for your kind contributions and for sharing these vignettes from your book. I would just like to remind our audience that if you happen to have any questions or comments for any of our speakers, please feel free to make use of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to articulate those to our speakers at the final segment of this webinar. So now I would like to invite our three speakers to engage each other in kind of a more interactive conversation.
May I start?
Yes, Celia.
Well, Sister Maeve, you know I'm an admirer of your book and of Martin of Porres for many reasons. And I think that today we tend to think of the saints as people who suffered. And Martin certainly suffered, right? Because of the racial structure of the time and the limitations on the life of someone with his background. But I think one of the things that I like about your approach to Martin, and I'd like you to speak about a bit more about it, is the idea of the joy in the beloved community. And you know, it's not a story of just suffering. It's a story of, I would think, finding, you know, love and the expression of love through joy in this life. I mean, could you speak to your ideas of Martin as someone who can teach us about the connection between love and joy and so on?
I think that, first of all, that Martin spent time every day as apart. Either he was hiding up behind the tabernacle where he could spend time unfound and spend time meditating and thinking of not only the day and of events and of people and praying for them, but of Jesus, of I'm sure, the deeper things of life. And he realized that he was given the greatest gift of all, which is the gift of the unconditional love of God. And if he has that anchor, I believe that was the thing that kept him going no matter what. And the joy then that comes from that is a spillover. It spills over. We're told constantly, and you too in your book, point up how much he smiled. Like he was smiling constantly. I think he did that consciously. I think he set out to create that, and I think that disarms people. You know that I shared with you that I see a modern prophet in John Baptiste from New Orleans, who's creating incredible music, who's winning Grammys, who will win more Grammys, and he's on a mission. He believes he's a channel of the divine through music, and he sets out to sing about joy, create happiness and joy and fun. And I think that we're badly in need of that. I think that we can get bombarded with so much that is dark and so much that is fearful, that we need joy. And I think there again, Martín de Porres just brought that. And even with any little family, I mean, there were any number of stories that I could have taken out of the book. But one was, sorting out family difficulties. Like he sorted out family difficulties by bringing the food and the drink for a party. It's like, come on, be human. I think it's that, be human. And it's a reminder to all of us. We all can get a bit up ourselves and a bit pompous, but be human and be humble and be joyful. Yeah. May I say something, Celia? I want to say, and I want to say it in front of my friends here on the panel, that the most wonderful thing for me was to find a researcher who I could know definitely had the facts right. Because the other part of an ancient saint is that lovely stories are told often, embellishing the life of a holy person. And it's hard sometimes to be able to bring out exactly what is the fact and what is it that people tell because they're so enamored with this life that maybe embellishes the facts. And I wanted to take the facts, they were the cornerstones, the foundation stones, and let my imagination and my reading inform what the times must have been like. What would cause him to give away the very bread that they were hungry for, or the coin that he needed to buy the bread with? What would do that? And so immerse myself in a story in my imagination as to what possibly could do that. And knowing from your research, Celia, that slaves in his time were marched past their house on the way to be caged at the end of the street before being sold. I'd imagine I would have given anything away if I was subjected to see that happen. So I could see then easily how he would have to give those things away. He'd have to.
Would you just explain the connection between your interest in Martín de Porres, and I know the Irish interest in Martín de Porres, and this Peruvian history of a Black man? I mean, what connects, because he's quite popular, or traditionally has been quite popular in the 20th century in Ireland. And
Ireland is amazing. I mean, I'm sure Vivian could speak to that. Ireland is amazing with regard to St. Martín de Porres. I think we were a very oppressed people. I think we knew serious hardship, and we knew serious denial of who we really were. I mean, we spent our time being really reminded that we were nobodies and not up to much, and in our history. And so as an oppressed people, it was very easy for us. I mean, to this day, people who pick up the book and start reading the story and get drawn into it talk to me about, I can tell you about my grandmother and even, now I'm going to jump a bit because thoughts are coming so quickly into my head, but Father Augustine probably doesn't know this, Vivian may, but the very week that this book was to be launched was a Friday, and Celia certainly knows this, and Celia and I were down in Dominican Publications, and when we had a little cup of coffee afterwards and we're crossing the street, I fell and had the most horrific break of my elbow. Really horrific. With the launch of the book on Friday, this happened on Monday. It's like, you know, when things like that happen, it's you pull on the example I did of St. Martin, and I just there's where my prayers then turned. Like, you are the healer, you are the miracle worker, and can I ask you to look after this? But I laughed at some of our sisters. Our sisters were terribly upset about this because the event had been planned and all of that. And now look at me now, the way I'm banged up, and really in a bad way with 2 bad breaks of the arm. And one of them came in and she said, where is St. Martin? And I have a little statue here in my room, and it's just over there in the corner. And she said, I have to do what my grandmother would have done. I have to put his face to the wall. I mean, in other words, I have to tell him that I'm not a bit happy with how things are working out for you. And I was quite taken with that there would have been this relationship with Martin, like, well, what is it? I'm annoyed that you've allowed this to happen at an important time. And I'll turn his face. And their practice was in their house, when his statue was on a shelf, that the statue's face would be turned to the wall. And I'd rather tickled me that I had never heard anything like that. But Irish people have a human type of warmth to Martin de Porres. Had you anything to add to that, Vivian?
Well, it's certainly true that the devotion to Blessed Martin, as he was, Blessed Martin, in the years before his canonization, was huge in Ireland. And there was an Irish Dominican called Louis Coffey,
That's right,
who was provincial for 8 years, but he was the great promoter of the cause of Blessed Martin.
Yeah.
And the city centre church of the Dominicans in Dublin was a great centre focus for this. And some of it maybe, like you said, that the Irish people at that time certainly felt that they'd been dealt a difficult hand over the course of history and identified with somebody who was excluded and belonged to a group of people that were pushed to the peripheries.
pushed.
Louis Coffey was a very skilled businessman also, and I mean the one sign of it was just a story about the canonization. He rented a liner to bring people from Ireland to Italy for the canonization, so he could bring 2,000 people and not have to worry about accommodation in Rome, because they parked them at Civitavecchia, which is the port of Rome, about an hour outside, and they had their accommodation and their transport in one. So that's the kind of genius that Louis Coffey was, and Blessed Martin was lucky to have a very, in some ways, a very different character.
Yes.
Promoting his cause in Ireland. Then after, I remember once he was canonized, people said, he's got what he wants now, Blessed Martin, he's a saint. So it's better to go to Padre Pio or somebody who's still on the way to beatification and canonization. They're more likely to respond to your prayers. But that's a kind of a simple approach to the economics of beatification and canonization.
Very good.
I have a question about it's a bit shocking really to see the social stratification reflected exactly within the religious communities. That can seem quite shocking to us, and but it was still there up to quite recently. I mean, there's still the lay brothers or the cooperator brothers, as we call them. Those is a small group now. Over the period of the order's history, there have been about 20% of the friars have been unordained in different categories: conversi, donati, lay brothers, cooperators. So I'm not sure whether, Celia, in your researches, you've come across any critical voices. Was there anybody from within the the religious communities. As far as I know, it was 1604 when the order dropped the stipulation that no black person may be received to the holy habit or professional order. 1604, when Martin was 24. So maybe some say he changed category at that stage, that he had been a donatus originally and was then able to be a professed friar. I don't know if you have any comment on that. I mean, two questions. One is about, are there any critical voices coming through? And the second is about whether Martin actually was able to change status.
Critical voices. The truth is that slavery and this caste system, which ranked people according to their ethnic origins, was completely naturalized in the colonial world. We live with the remnants of that today in Spanish America. And so you didn't have critical voices about asking for abolition of slavery. Nonetheless, there were people, particularly Dominicans, but most importantly, the Jesuits, who were saying we have to treat people humanely. They have to be brought into Christ. We have to allow them to marry whomever they wish. The church needs to protect certain rights that enslaved people and people of any poor, Black, mestizo, mixed race, or Indian people were entitled to. So it was a rather ambiguous situation, but in general, I have found that, you know, the convent had many slaves. All of the convents had many slaves. Everyone had slaves. It was not considered, it was just something people didn't question. And I tell my students, you know, I think in 2 generations, no one will eat meat. And people will say, our grandparents ate cows. You know, they ate meat.
Yes.
You know, this is crazy. And I think, you know, slavery is one of those things that we now know is abominable. And even at the time, of course, people suffered and it was in the records. But it was not particularly questioned by the elites in any rate. Of course, there was resistance among enslaved people, and there were rebellions and so on in the colonial world. And as far as your second question, yes, it seems that the Dominican order said that people could become men, could of these castes could become priests and take the orders. Nonetheless, what I have found is that in Peru, this was not enacted. And there's a case that I talk about in my book of a man called Fray Francisco de la Fe, I believe is his name, who got a papal dispensation from his condition. He was both illegitimate and the son of an enslaved woman. And so he got some sort of dispensation, probably legitimacy, to take orders. And this was in 1635 or so. And yet when he came and gave testimony in the Martín de Porres case, Vatican case later, you know, 30 years later, he was still a donatus. So for some reason or another, I believe locally the order was not willing to take that step at that time. And so it very much was a racially hierarchical world. And yet it's amazing because everyone sort of lived together. It was not a segregated city, and people lived among each other and were godparents to each other, all kinds of different, and they intermarried among castes and races, and Spaniards with African Peruvians and so on. It's a strange mix of that, but social mobility was very hard wrought, not impossible, but very hard wrought. And from what I can tell, the Dominicans of Lima were not allowing members of Black origin to take religious orders. They were not even lay brothers. Wait, maybe there were lay brothers.
So
yeah.
even within the unordained friars, among the unordained friars, there were different categories.
Yes.
Before never you talked about ordination to the priesthood.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, friends, oh, sister, go ahead.
No, I just thought I was going to ask Celia, was it she who had in her book about Martin's father wanting Martin to be recognized as a lay brother, thinking that that was a step up from what he was, which was a servant. And Martin himself did not want that to be.
Yeah, that is part of this some of this histories of. I haven't seen that in the documents that I looked at of the testimonies, direct testimonies, but yes, that is definitely part of the history. That his father was quite aghast that his son was not elevated beyond just a servant, and Martin preferred to stay in that status. And that to me, yeah.
It's still debated among the Dominicans that there's a history of the lay brothers came out some years ago, Augustine Thompson, and he says there's no evidence for Martin having become a fully professed member of the order. But the Peruvian Dominicans, whom I've met, are very anxious to argue that Martin was later in his life allowed to become a fully professed member of the order. So the debate continues among the Dominicans.
Yes, I see that.
Well, friends, it seems that we have come to the end of our hour. And although there weren't any questions or comments submitted by the audience, I think that the engagement and the questions that the speakers were able to ask each other was very nourishing and very insightful. So, so on behalf of all the members of our audience, I would just like to express our gratitude to our three speakers who have enlightened us through their reflections on the principles exemplified by Martín de Porres. And finally, I would like to thank you, the members of the online audience, for joining us today for Providence College's MLK Global Colloquium. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.